Ethical Adulthood, Capacity 2, Repairing Harm. In the last installment, I talked about the first of 5 capacities necessary for ethical adulthood. That was the capacity to tolerate discomfort. Now we move into the second capacity, which has to do with how we function in relationship. Because even when we can stay present with what we're feeling, we're still in contact with other people, and that contact has consequences. So this capacity is repairing harm without collapse, defensiveness, or self-erasure. If we are in relationship, we will cause harm. At some point, we will misread, we'll misspeak, we'll miss time, or hit a tender spot we didn't know was there. Not because we're monsters or idiots, but we learn to defend ourselves early, and it shows up fast when something we care about feels threatened. So this capacity isn't about preventing every rupture. It's about what we do after we realize rupture has occurred. Repair means you can stay present and responsible when something you did or something you failed to do had a negative impact on someone else. Without this capacity, relationships, well, they quietly erode, even when no one intends them to. So it may help to be very clear about what repair is not. Repair is not explaining what you meant. It isn't listing your good intentions, like they cancel impact. It isn't correcting the other person's interpretation of what you did so that you can feel exonerated. And it isn't collapsing into shame, making yourself the emergency, so the other person has to comfort you instead of being allowed to name what happened. Repair also isn't disappearing for hours or days and hoping time will erase the moment. Repair isn't any version of resignation either. It's not, I'm sorry, but this is just how I am. It's not, I'm not able to do any better than this. And it's not conditional accountability. If you would stop doing X, I might stop doing Y. The first pre-justifies future harm and refuses accountability, and the second makes accountability conditional. Both shift attention away from the impact that already occurred. So, what does repair actually require? Repair requires several things at the same time. Missing any one of them weakens the repair. The first thing is to stay in contact. Don't abandon the scene of the crime. It's important that we don't disappear, stonewall, or make the other person chase us for basic engagement. If you need some time, that may be understandable. Just ask for it and resume connection as soon as you're stable. The second thing that's really important is to acknowledge the effects and the impact. We can name what landed, even if it was not what we intended. Impact does not require intent to be real. I say this over and over because in many of our minds, if we meant well or simply meant no harm, then harm will not or should not occur. This offends the reality of harm and the reality of other people. The third thing is to take responsibility for our part. Owning our own contribution without excuses, counter-arguments, or defense of our own character. It's important that we not turn the repair into a request for the other person to apologize. We do not ask them to acknowledge our pain in the same moment. It is not leverage. We do not look for symmetry. It's not, here's my apology, now where's yours? We do not convert repair into a mutual clearing of accounts. We also do not approach the other person for their repair first. When we ask the other person to apologize during our repair, the repair stops being for them. It becomes a repair for us. Repair has a direction. The person whose action caused the harm does the work first. How do we know when repair is our responsibility? Well, this is where many people get stuck. Some people avoid repair altogether. They hope everyone just forgives and forgets. One time, 2 times, well, this might be okay. More than that, and it becomes intolerable. Others will fawn and take responsibility for everything and lose themselves. Both of those strategies are failures of this capacity. We are responsible for repair when our behavior had a negative effect, regardless of whether we intended to harm or not. Now, to be clear, we're not responsible for repairing another person's misinterpretation, projection, or unrelated wound. We need to use discernment. And to tell the difference, ask yourself these questions in order. Did I fail to do or do something observable? Something said, something done, something omitted, something decided or ignored. This is not a thought that you had or a feeling you experienced that you might need to repair for. Did that action reasonably affect the other person, even if we would not have reacted the same way, even if the impact surprises us? And then last, ask yourself, is the impact tied to my action rather than their history alone? If the harm would not exist without what we did, repair is likely ours. If the reaction is wildly disproportionate and unrelated, well, it may not be. So if the answer to the 2 questions is yes, repair is ours, and then you will not need certainty about the history or the reaction to begin. What is not yours to repair? Well, you're not responsible for repair when you're being asked to apologize for setting a reasonable boundary, or if you're being held responsible for something you did not do. If repair would require you to deny your own reality, your own needs, your own safety, then repair turns into self-erasure. That's not ethical repair. Ethical adulthood requires accurate responsibility, not maximal responsibility. And finally, repair does not require agreement. We can repair without agreeing on why it happened. We can repair without agreeing on the interpretation of the scene. We can repair without reflecting on who is to blame. It's about acknowledging impact that reasonably arose from your action. This keeps repair grounded in shared reality rather than negotiation. Now, once repair has happened, the relationship can resume, solving whatever issues were being addressed at the time, if that's appropriate. Repair is needed when something you did clearly caused harm. For example, You interrupt or override someone, and then they shut down. You make a joke that lands as dismissive or cruel. You fail to follow through on something important, and the other person is left carrying uncertainty. You withdraw for hours or days when someone needs clarity, contact, or a direct answer. These are everyday relational harms: misattunement, carelessness, avoidance. They're often easy to recognize after the fact, even if we didn't mean them. But repair is also needed in a different, less obvious set of situations, when the damage comes less from what happened exactly and more from how we responded. Repair may be required when we act as though harm or danger has occurred, when in fact it has not. And then that reaction creates harm. For example, you accuse someone of intent they don't have. You're trying to hurt me. You don't care if I'm upset. You are toxic. And the accusation itself becomes the injury. You name call, you question character, label someone unsafe in a moment of intensity. You escalate a disagreement into a moral indictment instead of staying with the actual issue. You recruit allies, you build a case, you turn a private rupture into a public narrative before you've done the direct work of repair. Well, another example. Perhaps you invite a friend over to watch a movie, and instead it gets turned into a topic of discussion over which there can be no agreement, and you refuse to let the discussion drop. One more. You routinely set appointments up with friends and then are a last-minute cancel or a no-show. And this is your usual behavior. If you want to repair those relationships, the responsibility lies with you. In these situations, the harm does not come primarily from the original interaction. It comes from the response or the delivery. Both kinds of harm are real. Both require repair. Feeling threatened and being in danger are not the same thing. When we treat them as identical, relationships pay the price. There are also moments when harm was not accidental, when you knew what you were doing, acted anyway, and hoped not to be exposed. If you've seen Ted Lasso, then you will know what I mean. Rebecca deliberately tries to thwart Ted's success. Her apology, once she was forced to face her responsibility by Keeley, was a stellar and near perfect example of what true repair looks like. Repair in these cases does not look like reassurance. It does not look like mitigation. It is not explanation. It looks like naming the truth plainly, without ornament, and accepting the consequences without bargaining. This kind of repair is rare because it requires giving up your innocence entirely. It says simply, I'm owning this, and it stops there. But when it does happen, well, it effectively and tenderly restores trust, not through persuasion, but through clarity. Why does this rupture repair capacity matter so much more after certainty collapses? Because when old moral frameworks fall away, many people lose their sense of how to be good. Repair becomes the anchor. If you can repair, you do not need to be perfect. You do not need to be innocent. You do not need to be right all the time. You can stay in relationship even when things go wrong. One grounding question. Can I stay present long enough to acknowledge the impact I had without defending myself, collapsing, or asking for something back? If yes, even briefly, repair is possible, and relationships can mature, deepen, and continue. Before I close, I want to introduce the next segment. Once we are able to recognize when we need to repair and learn how to do it well, once we can learn to stay present while inside our discomfort and take responsibility and remain in relationship, well, there's something else that shapes every interaction, whether we acknowledge it or not. Because not all positions in a relationship are equal. And not all impact is created on level ground. So the next capacity asks us to look more closely at something that's always present, but often avoided: power.